I wish to make a statement about this House's scrutiny of delegated powers during the pandemic and on the selection of amendments to the motion relating to the Coronavirus Act later today. The way in which the Government has exercised its powers to make secondary legislation during this crisis has been totally unsatisfactory. All too often, important statutory instruments have been published a matter of hours before they come into force, and some explanations why important measures have come into effect before they can be laid before this House has been unconvincing and shows a total disregard for the House. The Government must make greater efforts to prepare measures more quickly so that this House can debate and decide upon the most significant measures at the earliest possible point. The use of made affirmative statutory instruments under the urgency procedure gives rise to particular concern. I will give very sympathetic considerations to applications for urgent questions or emergency debates in such cases requiring ministers to come to the dispatch box to justify the use of such powers. I hope that all honourable members will have a chance to express their views through substantive, amendable motions on scrutiny of delegated powers or on the operation of the Coronavirus Act 2020 or both. But I turn now to the motion to be considered later today, which invites the House to make a narrow, binary choice as to whether the temporary provisions of the Coronavirus Act 2020 should or should not expire. Unfortunately, as it is only a 90-minute debate, as proceeding under the Act, under SO 16, I am disappointed that I cannot give additional time to discuss the issues. I know some members will be disappointed. When I became Speaker, I made it clear that I would take decisions on matters relating to procedure, guided by professional advice. I have concluded, on the basis of advice that I have received, that any amendment to the motion before the House risks giving rise to uncertainty about the decision the House has taken. This then risks decisions which are rightly the responsibility of Parliament, ultimately being determined by the courts. Lack of clarity in such important matters risks undermining the rule of law. I have therefore decided not to select any of the amendments to the motion. As I hope my earlier comments show, I have not taken this decision lightly. I am looking to the Government to remedy a situation I regard as completely unsatisfactory. I now look to the Government to rebuild the trust with this House and not treat it with the contempt that it has shown. We now come to questions to Prime Minister Jason Mccartney.
Number one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will want to join me in expressing my deepest sympathies to the families and friends of Sergeant Matt Ratana, who was tragically killed in Croydon on Friday. It is a reminder of the huge debt we owe to those who put their own lives at risk to keep us safe every day. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow sees the start of Black History Month. For generations, countless people of African and Caribbean descent have been shaping our nation's story, making a huge difference to our national and cultural life, and helping to make Britain a better place to be. And this is a fantastic moment to celebrate their contribution to our country. Mr. Speaker, this meeting I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The events sector, which includes weddings, festivals, conferences and music events, supports nearly 1 million jobs and is worth over £30 billion to the UK economy. It's been devastated by COVID. Revenue is down 90% since last year. Will the Prime Minister look at financial support focusing on grants, not just loans, especially for freelancers, including musicians and performers? And will the Government support proactive COVID-secure testing events to boost confidence and start to allow the events industry to support itself?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right to champion the sector in the way that he does. The £1.57 billion Culture Recovery Fund is clearly intended to support those organisations and the freelancers that he mentions. I think the vision that he lays out for people going to events where people could be tested before they go is absolutely right. And I hope that when that day comes, the public will show their support for this vital sector by visiting theatres as they reopen.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in sending my deepest condolences to the family and friends of Sergeant Matt Ratana? This was a truly appalling incident. And I have to say, every time I contemplate the circumstances, I shudder, and I suspect I'm speaking for a lot of people when I say that. It reminds us of the huge debt that we owe all of our police officers and the risks that they take every day to keep us safe. Mr. Speaker, over 16 million people, that's about 1 in 4, are now living under local restrictions. In recent months, 48 areas in England have gone into local restrictions. But only one has ever come out and stayed out. That's Luton. Why does the Prime Minister think that is?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right to draw attention to the importance of local lockdown measures, and I can just tell him and tell the House that since I last updated the House, he's absolutely right to say that there is now a serious and growing problem with the resurgence of the virus, and that's why we brought forward the package of measures that we did last week. The reason, I think, for the success of Luton is that local people pulled together to depress the virus, to follow the guidance, and that is the way forward for the entire country. And that is what we did before in March and April, and I've no doubt that that is what we're going to do again.
Mr. Speaker, when local restrictions were introduced, the Prime Minister described them as a whack-a-mole strategy. That implies that at some stage the mole goes down and restrictions are lifted. But in fact, in some lockdown areas, infection rates are still going up. And in towns like Bradford, Bury and Oldham, restrictions have now been in place for months. For many of those communities that are affected, things feel like they're getting worse, not better. So I ask a question on their behalf. What is the Prime Minister's strategy for bringing these cases out of restrictions so they can see their families again?
Well, Mr. Speaker, nobody wants to impose restrictions of this kind, whether in Bradford or anywhere else in the country. And we work very closely with local authorities to ensure that we have the right mix of the approach that we adopt. But frankly, when you have the virus going up in the way that it is now in some parts of the country, you have to take strong local action. I think one important difference between the way the virus is behaving this time and in the spring is it does appear at the moment as though the illness is more localised. That's why you need direct local action of the kind that we're taking, in addition to the strong national measures that we announced last week and which he supported, and whose effect we hope to see in the coming days and weeks.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, one of the major problems, as we've seen in the last 24 hours, is widespread confusion about the local restrictions. And I don't just mean the Prime Minister not knowing his own rules. Having sat opposite the Prime Minister at PMQs every week, that didn't come as a surprise to me. But let me quote to him the Conservative Council leader in Bolton, the Conservative leader. He said this about the government's handling of restrictions. It's breeding resentment. It's become too complex, too complicated. People feel very let down and very frustrated and very forgotten. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister doesn't understand the rules and his own council leaders are complaining about mixed messages, how does the Prime Minister expect the rest of the country to understand and follow the rules?
Mr. Speaker, actually, I think that the people in this country do understand and overwhelmingly do follow the rules, and that, I may say, is in spite of the efforts of the Leader of the Opposition continually to try to snipe from the sidelines undermine what we are trying to do. And he mentions the restrictions in the North East, and I cleared that matter up as fast as I could. It's very clear that you shouldn't mix indoors, either at home or in a hospitality setting, and you should avoid socialising outdoors. We need to apply that in the North East, because that is where it is spiking. I think people do understand why we're doing that. I think people too do get it. I think people want us to defeat this virus, and they want to see us doing it together, Mr. Speaker. And so, can I invite him? Sometimes he backs the government, sometimes he snipes from the sidelines. Can I ask him to be a little bit consistent, show some support? Let's hear him try and instil some confidence in the British people in the measures that he supports, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the idea that anybody who asks the Prime Minister a question at Prime Minister's questions is undermining the government effort is wearing a bit thin. We have openly supported the restrictions, but it's perfectly reasonable to ask why they're not working. Mr. Speaker, I spoke to the leader of Newcastle Council yesterday. He said the other big problem, apart from government messaging, is the lack of economic support being provided to local communities under restrictions. Newcastle Council indicate that by the end of the year, 10,000 jobs in hospitality will have been lost. Many businesses are forced to stay closed. Prime Minister, but for these extraordinary restrictions, these are viable jobs. These businesses are doing the right thing. Why has the government decided that these jobs aren't worth saving?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said repeatedly, we're putting our arms around the whole of the UK economy. We will do everything we can to save every job. I must say, I saw the leader of the Labour leader of Newcastle, and I was rather surprised by what he said, because actually, to the best of my knowledge, they were calling for the measures that we put in, and the best way to protect our jobs and our economy is to continue to work together to comply with the measures, to drive down the virus, to keep our children in education, which is an absolute priority for this country, and to keep the economy moving. That's what we want to do. Now, that's the strategy, that's the approach that he supported last week. He now says he simultaneously attacks and doesn't attack the restrictions. Which is it? He's got to make up his mind. If he supports the government policy, if he supports these restrictions, will he say so now?
Keir Starmer.
I support the restrictions. I've done so every single time the Prime Minister has introduced it. He well knows that. The question I've asked is, because of the restrictions, lots of people's jobs are at risk. Lots of people's jobs, 10,000 people's jobs in Newcastle in hospitality because of the restrictions. I support the restrictions. What I'm asking the Prime Minister is, can the economic support go in for those that will lose their jobs? And he didn't answer that. There's 10,000 people that wanted an answer to that last question because they're going to lose their jobs by Christmas. Prime Minister, you really should have answered it. The reality is that the Chancellor's made a political choice to reduce economic support just when the new health restrictions are coming in. If the Prime Minister doesn't accept that from me, maybe he'll listen to the following example from the Chancellor's own constituency. This is the business owner, Prime Minister. You might want to listen to what he has to say. We own a wedding venue in Richmond, North Yorkshire. The Chancellor's latest plan does nothing to help us. We can't employ people to work in events that the government are not allowing to take place. Our events team are looking in the face of redundancy, as we simply can't afford to pay wages when events are in lockdown. These jobs here are viable if only the government would allow us to return to work. My events team, he goes on to say, are talented and fantastic, and it's an insult to suggest their jobs are not worth saving. So this isn't about supporting restrictions, Prime Minister. It's about what the Prime Minister has to say to those that are at risk of losing their jobs and businesses. What, on behalf of the Chancellor, does he say to that business owner?
Just say, look, it's very important, but just to remind everybody, it is Prime Minister's questions, not opposition questions. Prime Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker, because I think that the answer is very clear. And I think last week the Labour Party supported the package, the Winter Economic Plan that the Chancellor put forward, and I think that most people looking at the 190 billion that we've invested in supporting people across this country will recognise, which is, by the way, the furlough plan alone was far more generous, is far more generous than any other European country. I think most people around the world can see that this government is putting its arms around the people of this country, helping them through, and we will help. And I know that the wedding sector has had a particularly tough time, and of course I feel for the gentleman that he refers to in Richmond in Yorkshire who wants his business to go ahead. But the best way forward for him and for all other business in the country is if we all pull together now, get the virus down, keep the economy moving. And in the meantime, yes, of course, this government is able to supply the support that is needed, which, by the way, is only possible because we had a prudent, sensible, one-nation Conservative party in power over the last 10 years, and the Labour Party would have bankrupted the country.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, it's refreshing to hear the Prime Minister trying to dig the Chancellor out of a hole for a change, but I don't think that will wash. The Prime Minister just doesn't get it. The problem with his argument is this. These are viable jobs, Prime Minister, but for the restrictions. The vacancies for new jobs just don't exist, and the training scheme the Prime Minister announced yesterday doesn't start until April. There is a gap here, and the Prime Minister shouldn't be so tin-eared to those whose jobs are at risk. Finally, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow marks the start of Black History Month. As well as celebrating the huge contribution black people have made to the UK, we must also reflect on the present and the structural inequalities and discrimination that sadly persist. For example, black women in the UK are 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth. That is truly shocking. Will the Prime Minister commit to addressing this and launch an urgent investigation into the issue?
The right honourable gentleman knows full well that this government has launched an urgent investigation into inequalities across the whole of society, and we will certainly address them in a thoroughgoing way. And I'm amazed that he seems ignorant of that fact. Absolutely amazed. I mean, Mr. Speaker, it is a quite extraordinary state of affairs. The right honourable gentleman's general line of questioning, because one moment he's supporting the restrictions, the next moment he seems to be opposing them. One day they're theoretically marching side by side with the rest of us trying to defeat coronavirus. The next minute they're off in the undergrowth firing from the sidelines. And I must repeat it. It was the Right Honourable Lady, the Shadow Education Secretary, who really revealed what Labour is all about, what the opposition is all about. She said this was a good crisis which they intended to exploit. We see this as a moment for the nation to come together, and that's what we're doing. And we are taking the tough decisions that will get this country forward. Take this country forward. Not just the lifetime skills guarantee, which he was kind enough to mention, but also the huge investments we're making in the NHS, in our policing, in affordable housing. This is the government, this is the party that is taking the tough decisions to take this country forward, while I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, once again, all they want to do is snipe from the sidelines.
David Mundell.